Welcome to episode 29 of the Tax Professionals podcast. Ex-President of the CIOT, Ray McCann, joins me in this episode to share his career experiences, tips and advice for you to learn from and apply to your own career.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Ray McCann has had a long and successful tax career. As well as being a past president of the CIOT, he has been a partner in two firms including Pinsent Masons, was a director at PwC and was assistant director at HMRC after spending almost 31 years there. These are all great achievements and I think you'll agree that he has had a successful tax career. That's why it's great to have him on the podcast, and in this episode, throughout, he shares some amusing stories including the fact he had to refer to himself as a partner, non-lawyer. For the first 23 minutes of the episode, Ray gives us a summary of his tax career, including the most valuable lesson he learnt after joining PwC from HMRC. Following this, he shares his experiences of being CIOT President, and from about 42 minutes into the episode, he shares his career advice and tips, which includes the one piece of career advice he would give to his younger self now, and the best piece of advice he has ever received. Just before we jump into the episode, I would like to mention that the Tax Professionals Book Club is now live. The intention behind the book club is to read and discuss books to help you and other tax professionals develop soft skills relevant to being a successful tax professional, whilst having the opportunity to network with other like-minded tax professionals. The June meetup was good fun, and we discussed the one thing, which is about improving productivity and achieving extraordinary results. There are 11 spaces in total, and at the time of recording this, there are 3 spaces available. The July book is called So Good They Can't Ignore You, and the August book is about how to speed read, which, given the amount of information we need to digest in tax, I think this is going to be an interesting read. Just to note as well, the book club is completely virtual, there's no face-to-face meetups, it's done over Teams. You can get further information about the book club by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/book club. That's thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/book club. If there are no spaces left when you look to join, but you're still interested, please let me know, because if I have enough interest, then I will look to add an extra meetup each month. Without further ado, let's get to it. Just to start off with us today, Ray, could you give us a bit of a summary of your tax career, particularly where you started off and where you are now?
Yeah, sure, Jack. I started what was the Inland Revenue in late 1975. At that time, I was a tax officer, which, as I recall, I think was the sort of second lowest or second most junior grade that you could get. That was a consequence of the fact that I'd been pretty hopeless at school, hadn't really had an awful lot of interest in academic stuff. And when I started there, it was in Centre 1 in East Kilbride, which was at that time, it was pretty much still the sort of dawn of the computerisation era. And I went into that office as a late teenager, sort of starry-eyed that I was going to be in this big modern technical building. And really all I was surrounded by was paper. There was just paper everywhere. The computer seemed to produce, absolute mountains of paper every single day. And the job seemed to consist of just filing stuff away. So you didn't actually learn very much in that office. And I stayed there. I mean, I think I actually was pretty good at the time, but in those days, to get promoted in the revenue, you had to be in the grade for a certain period of time. They called it you had to enter what was known as the field of review. And unless you were in the field of review, you couldn't get promoted. And each grade had a certain number of years that you had to do to get that. It's all changed now. But for me, the unfortunate thing was my entry into the field of review, if I can put it in that sort of fluency way, was in August 1979, which was 4 years after I joined the department. And in May 1979, Margaret Thatcher came to power with the Conservatives. And the first thing she did was slap on a promotion ban. So I got a nice letter saying that I had entered the field of review, but unfortunately there was a promotion ban. And as a consequence of that, I couldn't be promoted.
I was going to say how lucky that is with that timing then.
yeah, of course it was frustrating at the time. And but it had consequences that when I look back on it, it was actually, whilst it sounds a bit sort of counterintuitive, it was actually quite helpful. Because in 1979, I was early 20s at that point in time, and as you do, then you sort of take these things personally. And I decided at that point that I should look around and see whether there was a career outside the revenue that might be better. And I went for various job interviews, but most of the time, in fact, all of the time, the firms at that point, some of them are recognizable name-wise today, but most of them are now, for example, one of the big firms I remember was Deloitte and Touche, Touche Ross rather, which then became Deloitte and Touche, and then subsequently Deloitte's. And they obviously, as practices today, it's mainly concerned with trades, companies, entrepreneurs and so on. It's not really concerned with people who are on pay-as-you-earn, which was really all I had learned when I was in Centre 1 for 4 years, was how to handle pay-as-you-earn situation. And whilst I thought I was really, really good at it, what I was really, really good at was very, very limited. And I got a piece of advice from one of the partners of Touche Ross in Glasgow, who pointed me in the direction of what was then ATII, now CTA. And I remember having this conversation, and he said to me, he was explaining to me how my experience was Centre 1 and knowledge and so on, it just wasn't there for what they wanted, but he was pretty sure that my competence level was good and so on. And he suggested that I could look into whether I should study ATII. So I took that to heart, and off I went, and I started. I got a little correspondence course on ATII, and I used to sit at night time and study these terrible little books. They were a bit horrendous working through them. And I'd no sooner got through that than promotions opened up in the revenue again. And I was promoted and transferred to the Scottish Borders. And effectively my whole life changed because of that promotion ban, because up until that point, Centre 1 was so large that if you got promoted in Centre 1, you were 99% certain to stay in Centre 1. But in my case, because it had all changed, promotions became much, much tighter. And because there was a backlog, there were so many people getting promoted. And I ended up on the list of people who were promoted, but it was conditional upon you taking a residential transfer, in my case to the Scottish Borders, south of Edinburgh. But it's there's so many things in my life, career-wise, that I look back on and I think, well, at the time, it felt, it's a real rub, and what am I doing? I'm stepping at the unknown. But when I look back at it, I think it was actually for the best. So the promotion ban led to the transfer to the Scottish Borders, and the experience I got in the time I was in the Scottish Borders, you couldn't buy it really, because I had a portfolio of taxpayers, as the revenue called them in those days, customers now, that was mainly landed gentry really, who had enormous capital gains tax issues. They'd all sorts of multiple source income and so on, dukes and duchess, all that sort of stuff. So you got exposure to tax which was different tax from what anything I had ever seen when I was in Centre 1. And at the point I left in 1990, I regarded myself as a capital gains tax expert. And by and large, that has stuck with me. And at the point I left Galashiels, I had been promoted again to inspector at that stage. And on leaving, again, it was another period of disruption within the revenue. So effectively for me, 1990 was, I described it at the time, it was the last bus out of Scotland to get down south, Suffolk in my case, to undertake what in those days was known as full technical training. And if you got through the period of full technical training, you then were promoted to what is today referred to as grade 7. And that's where I ended up. But Suffolk wasn't dissimilar to Galashiels district in the Scottish Borders, in the sense, again, it was landed families, big farming estates. And again, the same sort of thing. But by the time I got there, I was also dealing with companies, and I was getting to know local accountants, and I was doing all the things that tax inspectors were supposed to do in those days. And field visits and stuff were always interesting because there was usually a nice pub attached to the field. So if you could organise a field visit, you had a good time. And as I say, I got promoted to grade 7 in Sudbury. And that really started out then the sort of expansion of my career into the sort of higher levels of the inland revenue at that point.
So how many years did you actually spend up being with HMRC in the end then?
I was 31 years in total. From 1997, I got transferred into London. I was in the Special Compliance Office. I was working on Code 8, Code 9 investigations, getting involved in search operations and so on. And then from there, I moved into what they would refer to as head office. I was in Special Investigations section. Then I moved into revenue policy based at Somerset House. And I started doing policy work, which culminated in the disclosure of tax avoidance scheme rules, which I was policy lead on from 2003 through to 2005 when I left there. And I left, the last job that I had in HMRC was as a senior case director in banking, with responsibility for big international banks. So my revenue career was very, very varied. And I mean, I look back on it and, one of the things that people have asked me is, do you not think you should have left earlier? And the answer is always easy, because the experience I got through the whole time I was in the revenue, you just simply couldn't have got it anywhere else. The big differentiator between a revenue career and a career in the private sector is you get a much higher level of authority and responsibility as a revenue person than you do if you're in a big four firm or a law firm and so on, simply because the checks and balances are required to make sure that the advice that's being given to the client is absolutely spot on and the firm is not leaving itself exposed to negligence claims and so on. Whereas as a revenue inspector, you get a huge amount of authority, or certainly in my time, you get a huge amount of authority. I think it's less these days with litigation and settlement strategy.
So in terms of like learning experiences, then really that 30 years in HMRC taught you a lot more than what you probably would have if you're out in, say, an accountancy practice instead, because of that authority you got, because of that almost more autonomy that you got than you would have elsewhere.
Oh yeah. I mean, the other aspect, as well as the sort of learning in terms of the study that you have to do to become an inspector. I think my training course, I think it was close to 7 years in total, time spent actually undertaking formal training. And then besides that, you've got the individuals that you're working with, the old district inspector. I mean, my district inspector in Scotland actually taught me to walk on water, was the way I used to describe it, because he filled you with so much confidence. I mean, he was a bit like a football manager, Tom. I mean, he passed away last year, which was obviously very sad, but he was like a football manager, really. He didn't really like to do the actual work. He was quite happy to encourage you to do the actual work, but he was always building you up. If there was a local accountant coming in who had a bit of a reputation, he would always sit there telling you know more than him, and you're great, you do that, and you do the next thing. And then of course when the thing would go settled, he would turn around and say, yeah, piece of cake, he was a pussycat, you wait till you take on some of the big guys. So he was a bit like, he was a kind of Alex Ferguson of the tax world. And when I moved down south, I did miss him, and some of the character, I mean, I see his character sometimes came out in the work that I did latterly. I don't think there were very many people in the private sector who regarded me as a bit of a pushover. And I remember once, I can't remember the circumstances in which I saw it, but I saw an internal memo from a then Big Five firm, and they were discussing the fact that I had been allocated to the case, and it wasn't giving the client much encouragement to be hopeful that it was going to have a happy outcome. So that was quite funny. But I always regarded myself as a bit of a pussycat.
So what then happened then when you finally moved from HMRC? Who did you go to after that? And I suppose what kind of spurred that decision to make the move after 30 years? Or 31 years, sorry.
Yeah, I'd moved into revenue policy in 2003, and I'd be the first to admit that the working on the policy was fine. It just wasn't an area that was ideal to my sort of outlook, not so much the skill set or knowledge and so on. It was just the way I view the world. It just wasn't an area that fit with me, like a glove. And then I was only in the job a few months, and I had a really brilliant job. I mean, I was appointed head of compliance strategy for the Inland Revenue, and I was really, really enthusiastic about it. And I loved the first few months, but then the O'Donnell review was announced, and it was kind of obvious to me that the O'Donnell review was going to lead to some sort of merger between the revenue and customs, which in itself I didn't actually mind, because for years I'd been sort of raising the question as to why VAT and income tax were dealt with by separate departments and why they didn't work together more closely and so on. So the idea of the merger never bothered me, but I got really bothered by the way the merger was rolled out and the pace at which the merger was rolled out. It was just far too slow. And then what started to emerge was a lot of criticism was being levelled by new management was being brought in. They were looking for private sector people to come and be the new chairs and so on, and there was a lot of criticism, and it culminated in a comment which was, if you want something done, you get a customs person. If you want to debate something all day long, you speak to the revenue. And I never really ever saw it like that. So over a period of 2 years, my enthusiasm for the job started to wane. And in late 2005, I made the decision at that point that I would move. And I joined PwC in April 2006.
Yeah. So what did you join PwC to do then in particular? Were you working in any specialism of tax or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, nominally in PwC, I was part of the tax investigations team. But at a practical level, on a day-to-day basis, I was working in the banking and capital markets team. And I think the attraction there was that the last job that I'd had in the revenue was a senior inspector in the banking team there. So it was good. But I mean, I worked mainly on disputes and tax problems affecting banks and hedge funds and so on. But towards the end of my PwC career, I had transitioned a bit into much more a kind of rounded client advisor. Because even today, I just generally work on the basis that I don't give advice in the sense that, clients who come to me, for example, and it's happened in the past, people will turn up, and they'll say, oh, I'm looking for someone to advise me on inheritance tax, and the best advice I give them is don't die. I've always regarded it as, ridiculous, the idea that I would sit there and advise people how to spend their money or, manage their wealth and so on. I've got people around about me who do that. And, I was fortunate with Joseph Haig-Aronson that, I've worked with Emma Chamberlain for the last 5 years who, there's very few people who are as competent and as knowledgeable when it comes to all that as she is. So generally, I've always avoided the idea that I would sit there and just give pure advice. So clients who had problems with HMRC, or even clients who were concerned that they might have problems, that was where I would operate. But I had, a really good time in PwC. I enjoyed the firm, met lots of great people, and did some really interesting things. And as I say, as my role softened, if I can put it that way, I then started getting involved in pitches for work, which was not tax investigations related. For example, new banks starting up in the market. As part of the PwC team that pitched for the work on the bank. And that was a really good experience because it took months to get the pitch properly worked out. So it was good insights and all that. But in the main, to some extent, I got a bit of a reputation at PwC as St. Jude because I was going around getting clients out of problems that other people couldn't really seem to see a solution to. I used to describe, I used to reach down in the mud and clean them all off a little bit, present them to HMRC and walk out the door with everything fixed. So that was by and large what I did in PwC. And to be blunt, it's more or less what I've done since I left HMRC is work in a sort of tax investigations dispute sort of area.
What do you think was the biggest learning curve you had between moving from HMRC then to PwC? Because I imagine they're completely different environments to each other. Is there anything that kind of stood out as like the biggest learning curve?
That's actually quite an easy question for me, Jack, because it took me probably 12 months to really acclimatise to what the difference was between the public sector and the commercial environment. And basically, at the point I left HMRC, I'd spent 31 years giving people the answer to the problem that they had, irrespective of how much time that was. And when I moved into PwC, I didn't immediately, step into a commercial mindset, if you like. So if a client approached me, I was quite happy to talk to the client for as long as the client wanted to talk to me. I wasn't always getting paid for it. So over a period of time, I sort of gradually realised, with the help of some of the more senior PwC people, I kind of developed a technique whereby I could talk to a client in a way that didn't feel dishonest to me, if that makes sense. And in as much that if a client came to me and I sort of knew the answer to the problem the client had, initially I would talk to them about what that answer would be, and that was all great. They loved all that. And large corporates, they'd go off and do it themselves. But over a period of time, I started to realise that isn't the best approach. It's not the best approach for the client, and it's not the best approach for me, or in that case, it wasn't the best approach for PwC because there's too much risk. And whilst I knew and still know my stuff in a whole range of different areas, tax is just too fast moving. And the quality of advice that you've got to give to the client has got to be spot on. In the revenue, and I'm sure you'll have seen this, and I think it's something that does annoy the private sector because they don't really understand it. If you're speaking to a corporate tax inspector in revenue, that's all he or she will talk about. If there's also a stamp duty land tax issue, well, that's somebody else. Or if there's a capital gains tax issue, that's somebody else. Or if there's an inheritance tax issue, that's someone else. Whereas if a client approaches PwC or your firm or my firm, they want the answer and they want all the different aspects of it picked up. They're not going to thank you if you give them absolute spot on advice on a corporate tax issue, but you fail to mention that, by the way, there's this SDLT point that you really need to be aware of. So that was the thing that impressed me most when I was in PwC, was just how comprehensive that organisation could be in terms of identifying what the client needed and making sure that everything that the client needed was provided in the advice memo. And for someone like me, for example, at the point I left the revenue, VAT, I knew as much about VAT, well, probably a little bit more, but not much more than, the average businessman in the street. So if a client came in to see me about some corporate point, the chances would be that maybe some important VAT issue could perhaps quite happily sail past me. So the process in PwC, actually, I got further training out of that, or further learning out of that, if you like, that a collaboration with your colleagues is essential within a private environment when you're dealing with clients, because the risk of getting it wrong is just so much greater.
Yeah. You've got to be so careful, haven't you, when giving advice, and to not miss anything, and to also give the full clear picture, particularly with how taxes interact as well, which by the sound of it, HMRC inspectors would be so focused on just their one tax that they wouldn't have to do that. So that sounds like it was a big difference then. So then after PwC, then where did you go next? What was your next move then?
Late 2010, I joined the law firm that was at that point in time McGregor's. Now, my thinking at that time was I'd had enough of the large corporate that was PwC. I really enjoyed it. And I must admit, I was in two minds at the point I left. There was a certain amount of regret, and still a bit of regret about leaving PwC at that time, but it felt like the right thing to do at the time. And I joined McGregor's, who were a Scottish law firm, but based in London. And my thinking at the time was I had one foot back in Scotland, but I didn't have to worry about the rain. So that would keep my wife happy. But before I knew where I was in McGregor's, really, they had merged with Pinsent Masons, and I found myself very quickly back in fact, I was working in the Pinsent Masons office in London, which is behind Liverpool Street, which was even bigger than the PwC office I had been working, which was beside London Bridge Station. So I found myself back in the big corporate wheel. But at the time I joined McGregor's in late 2010, my job title was director, but they told me that you have to act like a partner. You're in as a partner, but you're going to be called a director because under SRA, Solicitors Regulatory Authority rules, because you're not a lawyer, you can't be a partner. And this kind of bobbled along for a year or so until I got a bit grumpy about it, because it used to cause me problems with clients, because clients would say to me, "Oh, we don't want a director, we want a partner," and it was bad for business, really. So eventually, when the Pinsent Masons takeover happened, they reclassified my job to partner, non-lawyer, which always made me laugh because I had to tell people I'm a partner, but I'm not a lawyer. And it used to make some of the clients laugh because, when a partner turns up from a law firm, you expect that person to be a lawyer. And so I had to go through this, charade of, at the start of any conversation with a client, of emphasizing to them that I'm not a lawyer. And you could see the confusion in their face. And it did lead to some, pretty funny conversations, but I managed to sort it. And in the areas that I work, whether you're a lawyer or not, didn't really make a great deal of difference. And then in time, they even dropped the non-lawyer bit. Although they didn't drop it completely, because the partner level would be on the business card, but on the back of the business card in tiny little font would be non-lawyer.
It's funny, isn't it, the things that people do to try and risk mitigate things.
And then I got to, that was 2010, I got to 2015, and I had started to ramp up my involvement in the CIOT at that point. I was chair of professional standards. I was on CIOT Council from 2012. So I was looking at a situation where I could put myself forward to be an officer of the CIOT with the view to becoming president at some point. So I then looked at that stage to see whether I could sort of start to, reduce my, professional role in order to free up time that I could then put the maximum into the CIOT, what I was doing. And I left Pinsent Masons in 2015 and joined this very small private client law firm. And I was there for a year when I got asked if I would move into Joseph Haig Aronson to work alongside Graham Aronson, QC, and Emma Chamberlain at that point in time. In fact, it was Emma who'd asked me to go there. So I decided to do that, but it was on a kind of, well, I'll do it for a couple of years and see how it goes. And I was still there at the end of 2020 when I stepped down as a partner. But as I say, most of that move, whilst I was still really busy in Joseph Haig Aronson, I had gone in on the basis that, look, I'm going to have this big involvement with the CIOT, and within the next couple of years, I'm going to find my amount of time available to me is really, really limited. So if that doesn't appeal, then we stop now. But they were okay with that. And to be fair to Joseph Haig Aronson, they've never once grumbled at me over the amount of time that I spent on CIOT work.
Yeah. So it sounds like then there was a choice at some point then to actually go after becoming CIOT president at some point. What actually made you want to do that, and what kind of spurred that on?
So when I joined CIOT Council in 2012, the president of the CIOT comes from the council. And what was clear is that at the point I joined, I think there was already three individuals who were lined up to be president. And I was giving it some thought as to whether I would throw my hat in the ring for that. And it became one of these things that I sort of looked at the timeline and thought, well, if I'm going to do it, I have to do it 2016. If I don't do it 2016, then by the time it comes round again, I'll be getting on just too much. And the bit that worried me most was I didn't want to become CIOT president at a time when effectively I was time expired work-wise. I hadn't been in any proper frontline role, if I can put it that way, for a year, 2 years, maybe even 3 years. So I made the decision in 2016 that I would throw my hat in the ring for vice president, to become vice president in 2016. And I was working largely on the basis that someone's got to do it, which is the reality of the institute. Someone has. Whilst it's got a full-time staff, we're a volunteer organisation, and if people don't volunteer, the institute doesn't work. I think it's just as simple as that.
Yeah. Do you feel like when you did become CIOT president, that was like a big career milestone for you, or was it almost just like something that was normal to you at that point?
No. I mean, I saw becoming president of the CIOT. I saw that really as the pinnacle of my career. That it would be all downhill after that. But no, I saw that as being the sort of culmination of everything that I had worked for, both in terms of my time in the revenue had effectively prepared me to have a successful career in the private sector, and the work I had done in the private sector over that period of time from 2006 through to 2016 had effectively prepared me to be credible as a president. Because you wouldn't believe, Jack, the number of times people have asked me, clients have asked me, and it still happens. They'll say, "Now, I used to be an HMRC. Are you sure you're on my side?" And it always makes me chuckle a little bit. But I wanted to be credible. I didn't want to be a CIOT president that people looked at and thought, well, what has he ever done? So there was a certain amount of, quite a lot actually, of pressure on me to make sure that by the time I became CIOT president, I wasn't an individual that everybody would say, well, who's that? I wanted to actually have a presence within the private sector in the same way that I'd had a presence as an HMRC inspector in the private sector, but as an HMRC inspector, I wanted to create a new persona, if that makes sense, so that I was credible as a president.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I've never actually worked for HMRC, but the first time I ever tell people that I work in tax, they automatically assume that I am the tax man, as people usually say. So I can imagine that it must be much worse for you having worked there for 30 years and telling people that.
Well, when I was younger, Jack, I got to a point where if I was at a party, I used to tell people I worked in a carpet factory. Because if you told them you worked in the tax office, you were just, it was just painful at times because you just got everybody's problems.
Yeah, I feel like that now. I mean, like, if people ask me what I do, I say I work in tax, and I literally leave it at that because I know if it goes any further, they're probably just going to get bored because everyone seems to have this perception that tax is a boring career. Although I would happily refute that to anyone that wants to challenge me on it.
Well, let me see, it's funny because as your career progresses, Jan, what you'll find is that as your career progresses, the basic stuff, if I can put it that way, without sounding, as if I'm denigrating it, the kind of things you do at the early stage of your career, by the time you get to more advanced stage of your career, you're a bit vague on it. Like, for example, what's the personal allowance this year? Oh, I'm not sure. What point do you start paying higher rate tax? Well, I'm not absolutely certain, because you've got a book. So if you need to know that, there's a little book there that's got all the figures and stuff. So you don't keep them in the forefront of your mind. Whereas at the early stage of your career, when you're doing lots of calculations and you're helping clients with tax returns, all that stuff is just second nature to you. But you find when you get to that senior point, if you do get involved in conversations in the pub or something like that, where people ask you what you're doing, you say it's tax, they'll ask you a problem, but it's the kind of problem that you would have dealt with no problem 20 years before. Whereas they look at you when you're sort of vague as regards how much the personal line should be, or when you start paying higher rate tax, and then they decide that you're an idiot. So it does have its dangers. Your career progression does have its dangers.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But as I say, I used to tell people I worked in a carpet factory.
Well, that's one way to avoid the conversation anyway, isn't it?
Until you meet someone who does work in a carpet factory, trust me, then the conversation just goes downhill from that point.
So I think a lot of people out there probably don't understand exactly what being the CIOT president actually entails. And to be honest, I'm actually one of them as well. What is the role and the remit of the president? What are they meant to do, like, from an objective perspective? Do they have anything in particular that they're meant to do? Could you tell us a bit about all of that?
So I suppose at its simplest, the president is the kind of face, the ambassadorial face, if you like, of the institute. And the president also chairs the CIOT Council, which currently has around 30 members. Typically it meets 4 times a year. So the president is responsible for effectively the management of the council, and being the face to some extent of the institute in discussions with government, putting forward a vision for what the institute should be, the direction it's going to go, and effectively setting the direction of the institute during the period that person is an officer of the institute. And it's a sort of 4-year cycle: vice president, deputy president, president, and then you become immediate past president, where essentially the then new group of officers are just tapping into your knowledge and your experience and so on, to try and make sure that there's a consistency in terms of how the institute goes. Obviously the role is volunteer, so it's unpaid, and I suppose a president has got influence, but not a huge amount of power really, and I think it would be a pretty foolhardy president who set out to try and completely change the way in which the institute works. For example, if you look at my initial inaugural address in May 2018, I set out some ideas as regards how the institute would start to evolve and change and so on. But that was basically me reflecting the thoughts of what council were doing. So, an institute that would be, inclusive, every member would, be regarded as equal. Every member would have an opportunity to contribute to the work of the institute. An institute that encouraged its members to get involved through the branches and so on. And then representing the institute in discussions with other professional bodies, discussions with government, discussions with HMRC and so on. And being a voice really for the institute that helped us persuade and supported the work of our technical teams, because we've got our technical director, John Cullinane, we've got our director of education, Ross Baxter, we've got our new CEO, Helen Whiteman. So helping and supporting them through, I suppose, not saying something that people would regard as really sort of dumb, and not standing up there and making some claim about what the institute does that the institute just couldn't fulfil. And obviously the technical teams are working away on responding to consultations and so on, and quite a lot of that goes out in the president's name, but they're the ones that are doing it. Yeah,
so it very much sounds like a leadership role.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, you're not technical in the sense that you're actually working on issues. As president, I did work on some issues, but they tended to be, because the big issue at my time and during my time was really the tax avoidance debate, and whether professional advisors needed to be regulated more to constrain, the worst excesses of the tax avoidance industry, as it's labelled. So I did an awful lot of work on that in terms of trying to make that, something that made sense to members, but also government was attracted to, and so on. The professional conduct rules in relation to taxation, I was involved quite heavily with those. The big tax issue that emerged during my presidency was the loan charge, and I was quite vocal and had written a few things on how I saw that loan charge working, or actually in my case how I saw the loan charge not working, which I think is probably a more accurate description of what's happening with the loan charge. So it's, as I say, it's an ambassadorial role primarily, but one where you are part of the management of the institute and you're there to try and make sure that the wheels go around. But I think the truth of it is a sensible president will make sure that they don't actually stop the wheels going around. The institute had reached a point where change was coming to the institute. We were under pressure in terms of our, how we looked from, without, in terms of our, diversity and the accessibility of council, how council members were selected and so on. And I was on council and it was a mystery to me. And so, I had started with an agenda whereby I wanted to, professionalise the institute, democratise the institute, if that's a word. And I'd sort of set a kind of target that whilst we wouldn't fix all those problems by the time I stepped down as president, we would have at least started along the road to do it. And with the change of Chief Executive Officer to Helen, we were in a situation where we could then start looking so that we had the best person as their technical director, the best person as their director of education, the best finance function, and so on. And I think certainly in terms of our technical and education at that point in time, it would have been difficult to see, and they're both still there. It would be difficult to see who could have been better. John Cullinane, who's our technical director, is a former president, partner of Deloitte, and hugely experienced individual, and he's brilliant in the role. So there was a whole range of areas where I wanted the institute to move in a direction so that if you ask the CTA, how do you get on council? Because people ask me, how do you get on council? And in 2018, it was difficult to answer without it sounding like you would just be tapped up. Someone would tap you on the shoulder one day, whisper in your ear, do you fancy being on council? And you would be in. I wanted to move it to a situation where that people could see how you could, be appointed to council. They could see what the criteria was. They could understand what a council member was expected to do. And there was a process whereby our members could put themselves forward if they felt that they could contribute to council. And I tried a whole range of other things. I got some new members. I got them invited onto a council meeting so that they could come along and see how it worked. And I made sure that they got chances to give feedback and so on as to how council worked. And basically, I set out to try and make, from a personal experience perspective, to get the most bang for my bucks out of that year, but also for the institute to feel that it had someone as a president who was really trying to take the institute forward with ideas, really, rather than actions. Mainly because one individual can't change the institute taxation or any institute of that scale. It requires the collective effort. So you have to persuade people to buy into the vision that you've got as regards the direction the institute should go.
So it sounds like then if you can get onto council, if you really want to, there's a good chance you could become president one day.
Yeah, obviously, it's like any group. You have to be able to operate on council in a way that you're able to persuade your colleagues, not always be at loggerheads with them. And there have been occasions at council meetings where I've had quite vehement disagreement with some of my council members. But in the main, you have to see those disagreements for what they are, and the posture has typically got to be that you're all working together. You're all collectively responsible for the operation of the institute. Because if you're a council member, you're also a trustee of the institute, because the institute's a charity, which I'm sure you know. And so you have to exercise your responsibilities in the way that a trustee would. And you receive your trustee training every year, which brings you up to date with the latest developments in charity law and so on. So, it's a great experience, whether you're on committee or whether you're actually in CIOT council, and you can learn skills, and you can practice things that you might feel a wee bit less safe doing in the workspace. Presenting ideas to colleagues and so on, and have to argue your case and so on. I think sometimes people find it easier to do that in an environment like a committee meeting and so on than they would if they were sitting with their work colleagues.
Yeah. What's an experience then that you felt like you learned a lot from the time you were a council member all the way up until president? Is there any experience that stands out that you learned a lot from?
The meeting the members in the branches for all the branch meetings that I went to, that was actually really, really important, because what it did is it tempered because I've always been really someone who's, kind of passionate about change, if I can put it that way. I've never been someone who was happy standing still in anywhere I ever worked, any organisation I've ever worked in. I've always been really keen that, next year we'll try and make ourselves better, and next year I'll improve, and next year we'll improve the organisation. But when I got out meeting the CTAs on the ground, you started to get an appreciation for what the institute is for them. Because for someone who's on council, the institute is possibly, certainly in my case, at that time, the institute was a different thing from a CTA working in a local town or a local practice in a local town. There was a much more kind of family atmosphere. I went up to Aberdeen branch, and they were expressing all sorts of misgivings about the direction the council was going in. It was not the council, the CIOT was going in. It was getting too big, too many members. It would lose that family feel. And from meetings like that, I started to get a real sense of there was a danger if we developed too much, and if we went too much in the kind of direction that ordinarily I would say is the right direction, that we might lose more than we gain. And so it allowed me to, that experience allowed me to temper a little bit. And again, it was like part of the persuasion, allowed me to sort of find a voice that didn't sound threatening to someone who liked more kind of family atmosphere of the institute, but at the same time was progressive in the sense that we were adapting, developing, and we would be a modern institute fit for the 21st century.
I suppose in a way it sounds like you're trying to keep everyone happy at the same time, and also take the CIOT in a direction that was what you thought was right.
And I met an amazing bloke, absolutely amazing bloke in London, who had, he had about 70 years experience of tax, and he started his tax career just after the Second World War, and he was still interested, and he dug out the Tax Advisor magazine with my president's page, and he had highlighted and underlined various things. And in anticipation of the meeting with me, he then took me to task over some of the things I'd said in my little president's page, and I'm sitting there feeling sort of sheepish. And he was right. And he was right to do so, because it was his institute as much as it was my institute, or the institute of someone who's just qualified.
Have you got any particular examples across your career that you think was probably the most challenging or difficult time in your career? And could you tell us a little about that and what you learned from it?
Well, if you've worked in tax as long as I've had, you've had your ups and downs. Fortunately, in my case, it's been mainly ups. I have to say that. The downs have always been, the times I've always found it hardest is when you get rejection, when you don't get that promotion the first time, or you take on something, and it just doesn't work. As a revenue inspector, you take on a case that you think is an absolute slam dunk, and you suddenly find after a couple of years' work, you've got absolutely nothing to show for it. Or in private practice, you go for a pitch with a client and you just don't get the job. That always feels really, really hard. But you have to learn to live with that type of disappointment, and just move on and not let it affect you on the basis that in the end these things, they just aren't personal. And if you're sensible, you learn from it. Likewise with pitches, there are a whole range of things. What I used to find when I was in PwC is I'd be making pitches to group tax directors who used to be partners in KPMG. And you'd suddenly realise that the last person that they'd want to give the job to would be someone from PwC, and vice versa. And there is a sort of, it's not a club, but you've got lots of people who are in-house with large corporates who have got Big Four background, and inevitably they've got a kind of affinity with their old firm. And so that gets you in a situation where there are just things which will give you problems, and not allowing those problems to derail you, not taking the rejection and so on personally, and just focusing on what you do well. You get over them and you move on. And for me, when I was in the revenue, not getting a promotion at the right time always seemed to me a bit of a disaster. Going back to the point I made at the start, the promotion man coming in and putting paid to the fact that I was in the field of review, but I was going to have to wait 2 years to get on. Now that at the time, that felt really crushing. And I look back at my younger self and think, you really needed to grow up, Ray, because your early 20s, you've suddenly had a life-changing defeat. Life's just not like that. You've got too many years in front of you.
So basically, don't let rejections or the bad situations get you down. Just pick up from it, learn from it, and then move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're concerned about that, if you find that you're in a situation where you appear to be, just not succeeding, seek help. Speak to people who have, been successful, and speak to them and ask them to be honest. What is it about me that's not working? And again, various times over the years, people have been quite happy to give me critical advice. But ask people. If you find you're just not getting on with clients, speak to some of your colleagues and just ask them: is there something about the way I act? Is there something about the way I speak that upsets people? And you'll find your colleagues will be happy to tell you.
I'm a big fan of feedback, actually, because I think it's the best way you learn from things is by looking at or understanding what you've done wrong in the past from an outside view, particularly, and then figuring out what you could do differently in the future to make it better. I'm a big fan of feedback, but I do know people do find it hard to ask for it and to give it.
And the thing is, it's hard. It's hard to ask. It's hard to give it. But I think once you break that ice and you make it clear to whoever it is you're talking to that you will give honest feedback, and B, you want honest feedback, I think it becomes a bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as I say, there have been times in the past where people have offered me feedback, and you go skulking off, think, oh, what do they know? But I think if you're honest with yourself, and as I say, you pick the right colleague to give you feedback and make sure that you do get honesty. But act on it. Now, sometimes they'll give you feedback. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, for example, coming from Glasgow, it's taken me 30 years to not sound like I'm looking for a fight, because people in Glasgow sound most of the time like they're looking for a fight. Whereas I've got this nice, soft, posh English accent now. So that's a characteristic that you can't really do anything about.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think if you are upfront about wanting the honest feedback, that definitely does help. And I think, as you said as well, sometimes you might walk away after receiving feedback feeling absolutely furious and disagreeing with the person, etc. But if you give yourself a bit of time to sit and think about it and try and understand whether there's any truth in it, etc., then that's going to be the best thing to do. Because if you just disregard feedback all the time, you're never going to give yourself an opportunity to improve.
And what you'll find is you'll get the same feedback all the time, no matter who you speak to.
Yes, and then it's always just useless. A bit of a different one. Does any advice that you've been given over your career from someone else kind of stand out to you as a great piece of advice that you've received? And could you just briefly share that with us?
There's two bits I would highlight. The first one I've already mentioned, which was the bit of advice from the partner in Touche Ross about looking into the ATII. But the other bit of advice that has always stuck with me, when I moved to Scottish Borders, I had a female district inspector. And in those days, female district inspectors were pretty rare, mainly because the revenue at that time, when I joined in the early 70s, it was a very male-orientated organisation. Women found it difficult to rise to the top. But Isabel Jones, who was my district inspector at the time, she had actually got to the top. But I remember one day out of the blue, she took me aside and she gave me a sort of, I wouldn't say it was a lecture, but she gave me this advice about never cover anything up. And of course, being young and impressionable, I started to think that maybe she thought I had covered something up. But anyway, she was just talking generally. And the advice she gave me was, look, never cover anything up, because it's the cover up that always gets you. And it kind of struck a chord with me, because as a young teenager, I was very influenced by the whole Watergate thing in the early 70s, and President Nixon and so on, and Bernstein and Woodward doing all the investigative work. And it was so influential on me that the office Centre One at the time, physically it looked a little bit like the Washington Post office that you see in the movie. So that was kind of cool. So she always gave me that, and that is a rule that I have stuck to. That anytime I've ever made a mistake, an important mistake that's likely to cause problems, I've always been open about it. I've never tried to, cover it up. I mean, if I can fix it, great, but I've never allowed a serious mistake to just lie there waiting to be discovered by someone, particularly your boss, because that's just disastrous. So that's the one piece of advice, is always be honest, because everybody screws up. I mean, it's just a fact of life. It doesn't matter who they are. If you meet someone who tells you they've never screwed up, they're just being dishonest. I think it's simple as that. And if you make some kind of serious error, or you do something and then you look at it and you think, oh, I shouldn't have done that, you have to be open, because 99, you have to work on the basis that it will come out in the open. And 99 times out of 100, it will come out in the open pretty soon. The other one will eventually be discovered. And it's particularly important when you're dealing with clients. If you screw something up with a client, you have to be honest with the client. And if ultimately that means you lose a client, well, that's just the way of the world, because the consequences are just too grave otherwise. But the interesting thing about that, coming back to the Washington Post thing, I started my career with the idea that, I was this, cunning investigative type, and roll forward years and years later, and I actually spent the day with Carol Bernstein 5 years ago or so. I was speaking at a conference. Carol Bernstein was a delegate at the conference, and I spent the day chatting to him, and and it was really interesting. And I thought it was quite an interesting way of talking and telling your career. Some of the younger listeners to this might not know who Carl Bernstein is, but they should look him up, because he's a really interesting guy. And as I say, him and Bob Woodward were responsible for largely uncovering Nixon's cover up of the Watergate scandal. But as I say, that piece of advice, which was 1983, 84, something like that has always stuck with me. And I hope, looking back, that any time I've ever made some kind of serious mistake, I've always been open about it. And most of the time, all of the time, being open actually diffuses a situation. And that openness as well is, if you've done something wrong, and again, you find too often people will do something wrong and they won't admit that they've done something wrong. And what then happens is the dispute becomes whether there's an error there, rather than, well, okay, but here's a problem, how do we fix it?
I'm fully on board with you there anyway about being honest and upfront about stuff like that. It's probably the value that I put highest out of everything else is being honest. And I think you're absolutely right. Any mistake that you have and you don't own up to, the longer you leave it, the worse it's going to become when it finally does get discovered, and inevitably it will come out at some point.
Yeah. And the other bit of advice, Tom, who I mentioned earlier, my old DI, he gave me a bit of advice once, always follow your gut. And I think it's brilliant advice, because there've been times when I look back where I've been advised by this person to do that and another person to do something else, and you talk to your wife and you talk to the kids, but in the end, the direction you go in, you just have to take a deep breath and just trust your own instinct as to what you think is the right direction to go. And the move to Suffolk, for example, I was just racked with uncertainty as to whether that was a good thing to do. I mean, financially, it sounded catastrophic at the time, because we had to quadruple our mortgage. And the first 3 months of our mortgage, the mortgage payment was actually more than the take-home salary. And I thought, well, that's not very good. But, I just followed, in the end, regardless of what people were saying to me, I just sort of took a deep breath and I thought, what is for the best here? And I just thought, what does the timeline look like from here? And where will I might end up? And I just followed my instinct. And, that's generally, I can pinpoint several times in the past where ultimately it was just, what does my instinct tell me is the right thing to do? And most of the time it works. Occasionally, you're looking at it and think, oh, well, that sounded like a good idea at the time, but no. But most of the time, I ended up making what obviously worked out to be the right decision.
I think I'm just going to caveat that, and I think it's great advice in terms of what you want to do in terms of your career, but following it, if you don't know the actual tax answer to a question, you just follow your gut, you just destined for error and mistake.
Yeah, absolutely.
And risk. Just 2 last questions then, Ray. The first one is just about kind of now looking back at your career and knowing what you do know now. If you could give your younger self some advice, what would it be?
Most obviously, it would be relax a bit more. At times, I pursued my career at times with a kind of frenetic energy. And sometimes when I look back, there are jobs that I've done that I was really enjoying at the time, but was really anxious to get on to something that would then open up a doorway to get promoted and so on. And I think some of those occasions, I probably could have taken the time a bit more just to enjoy what I was doing at that stage and the people that I was working with. And whilst it's fine to be ambitious and career-minded and so on, sometimes where you are at a particular point in time is the right place, and you should just make sure that you get the maximum out of it at that point in time.
Oh, that's really, really interesting thought, actually, because I think at the moment I'm probably quite a lot like what you've been throughout your career, which is always looking for that next promotion or that next goal, etc. But that can become quite stressful at times, and so just sitting back and enjoying yourself in that position a bit sounds like it could make for a more enjoyable career.
Yeah, just enjoy the moment. And I think, to be fair, when I speak to people these days who are at the stage of their career that I was at when I was in my early 20s, I do get a sense that younger people these days are a bit more relaxed about their career ambitions. When I was in Pinsent Masons, I remember the managing partner of Pinsent Masons saying he remembered sort of 20 years earlier, if he had a group of associates in the room and he asked them who wanted to be a partner, they would all put their hands up. He says, whereas today he can fill the room with associates and he asks who wants to be a partner, and most people won't. And I think that probably is right, that people these days, I think, are better at making career choices and making decisions as to whether they actually want to do certain things. Whereas I don't actually remember clearly or at all thinking at various points in my career as to whether I should do something. It just always seemed to me I need to absolutely do something because I've got to keep going up this promotion ladder.
Yeah, I think there's definitely been a shift in that over the years. There's a lot more emphasis nowadays, I think, on a work-life balance, whereas for a lot of people, probably 15, 20 years ago, that wasn't even a consideration, really. Everyone was more focused on climbing that ladder instead, if you want to call it that. For people who are listening, who are really keen to progress and develop their career, notwithstanding what you've just said about relaxing and enjoying your career at some points, what advice do you have for them if they really do want to achieve that successful career? Have you got one kind of thought that comes to mind around that?
It's to be comfortable with the idea that tax is constantly changing, and be flexible, because the tax you do today won't necessarily be the tax you do tomorrow or the day after, and always keep your learning, constantly learning. I developed a technique years ago that I use, and there's nothing really original about it, that if I was in a meeting with someone and they mentioned a tax case that I didn't recognise, or they mentioned a piece of legislation that I didn't recognise, or anything really that I wasn't familiar with, I would go off and look it up, and I would just store it away. And I was amazed the number of times where the same thing would come up again. And you can come across, it's not quite bluffing it in tax, but you can come across extremely knowledgeable if you seem to know everything. And tax is just too varied now. As I'm prone to say, anyone who claims to have a complete knowledge of the UK tax system just plainly doesn't. I think it's just as simple as that these days. And I evidence it with when I started as an inspector in the early 80s, I could carry the whole Taxes Act in my little brown briefcase that they gave me, with ER on it and a little crown. So I could carry the entirety of the Taxes Acts, the hard copy of the Taxes Acts, in that little case, and still have room for my sandwiches. Whereas nowadays, you just can't do it. You just can't do it now, because it's just too much, and there's too much to know. And it's not just the legislation, it's all the extra stuff. So you have to just keep learning. You have to be flexible in terms of your approach to your career. Some people specialize in private client, small businesses. They like the idea of large corporates. That's all fine. But one of the individuals that I worked beside in PwC when I first joined, his part of the business had been destroyed by DOTAS. So within 2 years of DOTAS being announced, his business didn't exist anymore within the firm, because the firm had just stopped doing the stuff that his business was involved in. So he was quite happy, sailing away as a partner. 2004, bang, and he just watched over the next couple of years his business dying, and he kind of reimagined himself into a different line. And by the time he started working with me, he was doing something completely different from what he was doing 2 years earlier.
So basically, you never know what's around the corner, really, do you? But I do think one thing you said there actually was really useful. So back in the day, it sounds like anything to do with any taxes that you came across that you didn't know of, you'd look into it. But nowadays, I almost think like that can be translated to within your own specialism instead, and just focus on your own specialism. Because I'm with you. There's absolutely no way that anyone nowadays knows everything about all the taxes within the UK. It's just impossible. Unless you literally just read the tax legislation and guidance all day, every day, which I'm sure no one in the country does. So just do it within the specialism. And I think that's going to be a good way to build up your knowledge over time.
Yeah, and just recognising that you can't know everything, and that there's no shame in, turning around to someone and saying, I don't know the answer to that. It's you don't even need to say it's not my area. There's just no shame in saying to someone, I don't know the answer to that. And even if it is in your area and you don't know the answer, there's no shame in saying, I don't know the answer to that, or I'll need to research that, and so on, because that's the reality of it. And, anyone who pretends otherwise is just heading for a complaint at some stage or a negligence claim. Yeah.
Well, saying no is not going to get you sued, whereas guessing the answer is likely to get you sued.
Well, I mean, it's not so much no, Jack. It's just, being honest that you don't know, but you will find out.
Yes, of course. Yes. Anyway, thanks for that then, Ray. I really appreciate you joining me on the podcast today. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm sure listeners are going to take a lot of useful tips from this.
Yeah, it was great, Jack. It was really good to talk to you.
Show notes for this episode can be accessed at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP29, which will include a link to more details about the Tax Professionals Book Club, or you can access that by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/book club. If you like the episode, then make sure that you don't miss out on any new ones that will help you to progress, develop and improve your tax career by signing up for email notifications at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe. Each email notification will give you a brief summary of the episode so that you can decide whether or not you want to listen. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you liked the episode and have taken away some useful points to help you progress, develop and improve your tax career. Until next time.